can't actually see my phone and my wire wrapping at the same time. So, Pam, if you have something to say, did you find it? No, you didn't. Looking for it. Okay, now the other question. Pam, can you hear me? Yeah, I see you. Can you hear me? Can you not hear me? Because you're not responding. Yes, you can hear me. Okay, good. You're like the only person watching anyway, so it's fun. Technically, I have to lean backwards and around the corner to see the phone. So, if you ask me a question, I'm not going to know about it right away. Anna, get out of my seat. Anna. Look at this. This is in my seat. Shoo, Anna. Come down. Thank you, baby girl. So, I have a tiny black tourmaline and 3 little blue sapphires I'm using on this one, and a sheet of paper because my table's really dark and I figured you wouldn't be able to see anything otherwise. Also, considering that you just responded to the kitty, I'm assuming there's a delay. So generally, I start out my stuff with a frame. And in this case, I'm doing another tiny pendant, so I'm going to start out with a frame that's 20 gauge. And I'm just going to kind of make up whatever shape I want this pendant to be. So if I want a little teardrop, we're going to do this. And I don't know if I can actually... I can. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so you can see this better. Hey. So, I will make a little teardrop or something. Usually, I create my bails by just bringing this guy around the back and leaving a tiny bump, unless I want a crazy large woven bail. So once he's around, I just need to tie off these 2 ends, and this guy is way too long, and so is this guy. And I'm making this, and you're gonna want this, and there's no pink in it. And this guy right here pretty much becomes the building block of the entire rest of the pendant. Raise the camera a bit. Oh, well, that was a bit too much. Better? I'm trying to use the paper as a kind of note for myself as to where to hold things, so I apologize if I'm holding them in the wrong place. So here we go. Little frame. Backwards you can see a small bail for sending your chain through at the end. And then usually I'll figure out, do I want my crystal here? Do I want it in the middle? Wherever I want it. And I'm going to run some wires in this direction that are going to help hold that into place. So I have a bunch of scrap wires over here. Rather than waste them, I'm going to use them for that. That's not half round at all. You are half round. Yes, you are. Hey! Dog, come on. This is not a jungle gym. This is my living room. Please don't. So one of the important things when I'm doing this is just taking my pliers and making sure that I flatten out anything that I connect to the frame so that it doesn't leave something pointy sticking out the back here, because that's what's going to make it a comfortable pendant to wear. And really at this point, it's not doing much of anything that requires a lot of skill. It's just kind of smushing all the pieces together so that we can start adding the building blocks. So that's one piece. And that guy lets me kind of set this here and it doesn't fall through anymore. Also, why are you messaging me on Messenger? That's an old message. Okay. So once you have something that keeps your piece from falling through the back, I can still kind of push it through at the bottom here. So I'm going to add one more, and that's going to be right about here, and that'll give me a secure seat for when I do finally attach my crystal and want it to stay there. And then what I should really do is just go live anytime that I wire wrap, because I have the worst habit of talking to myself while I wire wrap anyway, and telling the wire wrap what I want it to do and why. And I don't want to use too much wire when I wrap around the frame to tie these things on, because there's going to be other stuff that I want to connect to the frame, and I don't want to take up all of the frame's room so that I can't put anything else there. So then I have this, and if I set it down, it no longer pushes through. And that's the important thing for when you're going to connect things, is that you have a steady place for it to sit down. And that gives us our little start out frame. And then I start building pieces. I made this one with a drill. And it is, let's see if I can get it to focus on that. Probably not yet. It is just a small piece of half round wrapped around regular wire. And I used a drill for it, and it's really noisy, so I usually make a bunch of these and just kind of keep them around. And then go back later and get whatever length I need. So if I take this one, it should wrap. Actually, this one goes all the way around. So I can kind of start creating an outline on my piece by connecting this guy up here. And I don't need this. I'm really just trying to get this pinched down well so that I can then bring this around and run it around the outside of my frame. And this guy will kind of just hover here. I use these when I put these on kind of as a little wall to sort of keep everything in. When I set this guy in here, it's going to add a little bit of height over here that kind of helps hold it in. And it gives it a nice edge and look. And also because you're running it around the frame, it's going to overlap this area where you have everything connected to the frame and kind of hide that boogie looking stuff that you end up with. So that is generally how I start most of my frames. It's just a nice outside piece, whether it's a larger piece with a channel set or whether it's a small piece with just one of these guys. And then I kind of set them aside and start building other pieces. And one of the things that I want to put on this piece, I'm going to grab a couple pieces of square wire. I might have scrap square wire. I have scrap half round. I have one. And the piece I stabbed myself with earlier. 2 pieces of square wire. And I'm gonna hold this and I'm gonna drag it through here, this pair of nylon tip pliers, and this will straighten it, give me a much nicer wire to work with. And if you have dead soft wire and you need a little bit harder, you can draw it through a bunch of times to kind of work harden it. But in this case, I'm not worried about that as much as I am just being able to run 2 straight pieces of wire next to each other. So these are my 2 square wires. They're actually way longer than they need to be, but I'll trim them off at the end. And then I need 2 pieces of half round to match them. Grab the other piece off the spool if I can find the end of it. What have I done? It's hiding over here. And the stuff off the spool is usually fairly straight already, so I don't have to straighten it if I'm not using scrap. And then my weaving wire, I usually leave on the spool because I never know exactly how much of it I'm gonna need. And I'm just gonna kind of stack these together and wrap this guy around to hold them in place. And I'm wrapping the square pieces flat against each other, and the flat part of the half round I am wrapping against the square pieces. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to take both of the half round pieces and bring them upward and get them out of my way for a second. And we're going to make a place for these teeny tiny little sapphire guys to sit. So I'm going to take, these pliers are round at the tips. So I'm going to take this to just make a super tiny little dip for the point to go into. And I might have actually made this a little bit too big. I'm going to check and make sure that this guy doesn't fall right through it. Oh. And he doesn't, he's good. So then we'll bring the half round back over top of it to hold it down. And when we do this, the very first time it has a tendency to push these guys kind of out of the way. There we go. So once I push these down, I don't know if you can see this, but it's gonna hold that stone in there, but it's also gonna overlap most of the stone at this point with these really small stones. I'm going to take my wire and cross it behind it and actually tighten these four guys together so that the stone is held into place. And then I'm going to take my fingernails and actually spread these apart to reveal my stone. And when I do that, I just want to be careful that I bring it out to the edges of the stone, but not so far out that the stone falls out. And I apologize profusely that this is terrible quality and the people who are popping in keep leaving. But that gives us a little tiny guy right here. And I'm not sure if you can see with the lighting that that is blue, but that's one of our little blue sapphires. We're going to go ahead and go on to the next one. And it's pretty much the same steps at this point. We're going to pull these two half rounds out of the way, and we want to make a little rounded seat out of these two half rounds. And I'm going to use the very tip of these round pliers to just create this little round basket. And check and make sure that this sapphire will sit right in there, if I don't throw it, which I tend to do a lot with these tinier stones. So the tip is going to sit right into there, and then you're going to bring these half round down again and kind of press them into place to hold that guy down. And again, we're going to come around the back and tighten this down a couple times. And once we've got that down in there, then I go in and I just separate these out so that you can see the stone. And I find that I don't have this problem with having to separate things out as much with the larger stones, but when I separate with the smaller stones early, what ends up happening is I can't get them to lock in well. They tend to pop right out the middle. So I've just found it easier to go ahead and get them locked down first and then spread it out so that the stones are visible. And then I'm gonna go for my third one. And I just pulled one of the square wires up, didn't I? Okay. Make sure you're pulling the half rounds up and not the square wires, because that's not where the square wire goes. And I'm not sure, honestly. I'm kind of hinky about this sapphire because it is extremely shallow. So I'm gonna make this circle a little bit smaller than the other two because I am not sure if you can see this on here, but there is almost no bottom to this guy. But I hate to waste him, so I'm putting him in here anyway. If I can. If I can tell which side of him is the top, even. Okay, so now we have our little channel set of, I believe these are 3mm sapphires. And I don't have my millimeter guy to check, but those guys will go along the side here. And I'm going to just put this aside until I'm ready to use it. And I like to usually leave a small tail right here, so that when I come back in, if I need to connect it to something or anything like that, I can. And then coming back in here, I'm going to start looking into connecting this guy down. And I'm going to use pretty much a similar tactic, almost mirror image, if I can get it out, to this guy right here. So you can see right here, these guys, we have a similar setting with our sapphires here. And then I'm going to create this inside part that actually holds the crystal down. And that is made with 3 pieces of 20 gauge wire, and you can do it with 3 pieces of square, 3 pieces of round. Personally, I've been doing them with round because my spool of round is longer than my spool of square, so I'm using it up. And this is like video evidence of my, I just grab way too much wire every time and then figure out what to do with the scraps later. Because I'm about 100% positive I don't need this much wire. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with my square. I'm going to pinch it and I'm going to straighten it. And this is just going to make wrapping it a whole lot easier because I'm not going to have to fight to keep these 3 wires right next to each other. And if I suddenly disappear and stop talking, or suddenly disappear and you hear me in the background, it's because my dog is getting dangerously close to doing stuff he's not supposed to be doing, and he's looking at me so he knows I know. So now that we have our 3 pieces, I am actually, because I'm kind of mirror imaging this one, and I need to go in the opposite direction because we're going to want it to curve this way. So I want my ends to be on this side. And I'm just going to go around to all 3 wires a few times to start holding them together. And when I do this, I used to have a really bad habit of going through and tightening it down way too tight. And then when it comes to this next part, and you want to go around just 2 wires, you can't crank this wire down in here because these are held too tight together. So you want to get it taut without making it super, super tight, or else you can't get your wires close together. You're going to have gaps in every single one of these switches between around 2 and around all 3. And I'm just counting off. I usually do about 6 around all 3, and then 12 around only 2, and then back to around all 3. And sometimes you're talking and you lose count, so you have to go back in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And make sure you know where you are in your counts. And then when I go around all 3, sometimes I find it's easier, especially if you have long tails that you're working with, just to twist the whole thing. And then we're going back to just around the 2. And every now and then I will take my fingers and just kind of press these guys close together. And I've lost Pam. Okay, well, I'm sure she'll be back. So we're going to go ahead and count out our 12 again. 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Press those down tight and nice against each other. 1, 2, 6. And then as we're going, every now and then I'm just going to pick this up and check how far along I am, because when we get to around here where the bottom of this crystal is going to set, we want to break some of those wires off, and they're going to work as the prongs. So you just want to make sure you haven't gone past that point yet, because if you have, you're going to have to start unraveling, and that's never fun. I believe the term in knitting is to frog it, because you rip it, but I don't know if there is a term for unraveling your entire wire wrapping weave. And we're just continuing. I apologize, this part is not the most exciting to watch. It's really basic, just counting to 6, counting to 12 repeatedly. even then, I'm going too far. Every now and then too, if you notice that, like me, your wires are starting to kind of push over top of each other, you can go in there with your nylon tipped pliers and just kind of flatten everything out so that you have a nice smooth weave right there. So we've got our weave right here, and I'm going to do another check right here. And just kind of judging from how far we've gotten, it looks like one more set right here is going to be enough to put us where we want to be. So let's do our 12. And we're doing our 6 around all 3. 3, 6. And I'm going to wrap it once or twice around here really quick. And I'm going to check because we should be right about where we want to be on our frame. So right here, we're at the point where this right here is where we want our crystal to sit. And so I'm going to trim down these obnoxiously long tails because I never measure things and always make them far too long. And then I've found that honestly the best way to make small loops with wire, as far as I'm concerned, is just bending the wire and letting it organically create a loop, and it's going to automatically kind of round itself out. And we're going to do this with both of these guys here. Kind of bring them around. And this is going to create us almost a little prong. So when I set it here, it's going to overlap where I want my crystal to sit, and this is going to hold that crystal in. And I'll see if we can bring this up here. And you can see this is that part that I'm working on now where we get our little prongs, and they're going to overlap the bottom of that crystal and kind of hold it in place. So in order for that to work, one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 3 guys up here, and I'm going to kind of loop them around alongside the bail that I created earlier when I created my frame. Just to let me know exactly where this is going to sit against the frame. And hang on just 1 second. All the knocking. Okay. So, we want this guy, and now I dropped it. Okay, here we go. We want to know where this guy is going to sit exactly so that we can take this part and really kind of form it around the crystal. So now that I've got this guy pretty much where I'm going to want him sitting, I'm going to connect him and this outside wire to the frame together. And I'm going to bring this outside wire around as well. Trim it short. also going to trim this guy, my weaving wire, just so I can get this spool out of my way. And we've got all the little ends we want to clean up as we're doing this. Trimming off edges and smoothing them down flat with your pliers. And when we bring this guy in, we want these two loops to go around the back of the frame. So we're going to pass them through the back so that they'll swing around behind our crystal. And you can kind of see this taking shape already as we're layering the pieces together. And when I connect things to the frame like this, I try to aim for these parts where I've gone across all of the wires, because you can take your weaving wire and you can draw it down tight. And when you do so, it's going to actually kind of pop into that weave and disappear. So it's not as visible how you connected it to your frame. So you'll take this guy, and if you pull it down, you can actually get it to slide down in there. And that wire will just disappear and become part of those 6, now 7 wires across. And once you've done that, you can look at, I generally go underneath the other wire so that we're doing an over-under thing, and then back around it. And with these coils of half round around 20 gauge, similarly, you can pull your weaving wire that you're connecting it to the frame with into one of those little dips that the half round has created, and it's not only going to make it kind of disappear, it's going to help set exactly where on the frame you want this piece sitting, because that half round is going to keep your wire from sliding up and down. So once I have this exactly where I want it, which is going to take a second because I am fighting this piece of wire that is actually just a little bit too long. There we go. Once I have it where I want it here, I will go around to the back and actually connect it to the frame. And that's just going to be sliding it between, I'm trying to get this so you can see it, between your wire that you've been weaving and the frame, and just wrapping it several times around the frame to hold it tight on there. Come on, buddy. Slide on through there. And the same thing is going to go for the other piece of wire that's coming over here. We want to also use that and wrap it around the frame a couple times, and that's going to tie it down. And the one thing that I notice, besides the fact that I'm holding this in a horrible position, I'm so sorry, the one thing that I notice when I'm working on these is that sometimes when you first start putting these pieces on, it can feel very unwieldy as you're layering them together. And then as you work on the pendant, you're gonna feel as they kind of start falling into place and working together better. And in this case, I'm going to bring this guy here now that he's connected. I'm just gonna wrap this around this bottom wire a few more times before I trim him off. And as with everywhere that I leave a tail, I will go in and smooth it down nice and flat. I'm just gonna kind of bring this around here just a tiny bit so that it runs along the inside of this half round wrapped 20 gauge. So once we bring that around there, we can kind of loop over and through these guys, and that is also going to help hold them to the frame. And I'm going to cut this tail slightly because all my tails are way too long. And tuck this through right here. And once we have this, we've got pretty much all the pieces to really kind of mount the stone in. I know I'm kind of not doing a good job of showing this on the camera, so I'm sorry, Pam. But when I do that, I kind of have to just adjust these guys, lifting them up and out until they wrap around the stone here. And that's gonna give me a place where this sets in. As far as this one, I'm actually using a slightly skinnier stone than I used in the pendant that I am emulating for this video. So it's leaving me a small amount of open space on the side. And there are times when I would say, hey, I'm gonna go in and figure out what to do with this small space that I need to figure out what to do with, but in this case I am pretty flush on black tourmaline crystals, so I'm gonna dig out that bag really quick and see if I have one that fits in there better. Oh, these are green. If I didn't lose it when I cleaned. Or, ah, and Pam is saying, I knew I was going to get you to make pink. I can check my pink ones. And that one would work, except it's just a tiny bit too tall. So I'm going to look for a similar one that's a little bit shorter. That guy kind of sits in there, but he's not very pink. And this is the Pam live stream, so we're going to see if we can find a pink one that'll slide on in there. And right there, we have a Yahtzee. A nice little pink crystal that fits in there. And once it's in, it slides in and it just grabs on and stays there. And that's what we're looking for. Are you happy, Pam? It's pink. I actually don't know if you're sending messages. I'm looking. Says you're back. I can't tell who. I don't know how to tell who's actually watching. I hope it's you, Pam, because I just switched to pink because of you. So I'm gonna put all these guys back. And I'm actually pretty happy with the pairing of the pink and the blue sapphires too. So smoothing this out and just kind of clearing these guys. On my initial version of this pendant, I had brought this one and stopped it right about here, as you can see, and just tied it off. And in this case, I've brought it all the way up, so it's a little bit different, but it's still functioning to hold the piece together. And then these two back guys, on the initial piece, I brought around and used a loop to actually hold this guy in. But I'm making a similar piece. I don't want it to be an exact mirror image, so I'm gonna do this a little bit differently, which means that I'm just gonna go back here and tie these two loops off right on the bottom of the frame. And in order to do that, I'm gonna kind of snip and give myself just a little bit of wire. And I'm gonna take a pair of pliers and I'm just gonna start turning them until I kind of create a circle. And I'm gonna feed that circle around the frame. The nice part about this stage is I can pop the crystal out for just a second so that I can get up under here. Press these down so that they're not leaving any points. Because as we discussed before, pointy stuff on the back of the pendants is never good. So that gives us our little tab that we're going to slide this down into. And we've got the start of our pendant. Now, I'm going to take 2 square wires and I'm going to use them to create a loop similar to this guy right here. I'm sorry, I just realized I'm not in the frame. My paper is failing me. This guy right here, which has the wires that go back and forth through it, I'm going to look into creating one on this pendant, and I'm going to do it a little bit differently just to show you. This one I've run these right along the side of it. I want to make a slightly larger one here that's going to cover this whole area, actually overlap part of the crystal, and then come up to here. And then I want to actually run these over top of it instead of running them along the side of it. So it's going to give it a little bit different of a look. And the first part of that is just getting your 2 wires that you're going to use to create that loop. And I'm going to use the trimmed off pieces of the wires that I keep cutting too long, because I do hate wasting things actually. There's no reason to waste the wire. It works perfectly fine. So I'm going to start right here where I plan on bringing it above the frame. And I want the smaller piece of wire on the inside since it's going to loop downward sooner. And I'm just going to actually form kind of the direction that I want it to take. And the same for this guy. And that is going to give me sort of a guide. So when I slide these guys out of here, I have kind of an idea how I want them to sit. And I'm going to go back in there because this is terrible right now. I'm going to go back in there in a second and actually smooth these out to nicer, cleaner swirls. I have 30 million pairs of pliers in the screen. And this guy. So it starts out just wrapping around both of them to hold them together. And once you've held them together, you're going to go around one again, and then around the one that's right underneath it. And it's just a back and forth. 1, 2, and then around the back. 1, 2, and then again around the back, and 2 on the other one. And while the wires are really close together, you won't see it. But this part where we cross around the back, that is what is eventually going to cause this threading between the two. So now that we have it to where it's held together, I'm going to go in here one more time. Slide our crystal back in where it belongs. And then we're just going to check and make sure that we're happy with where this is going. And at this point, now that we have this set up to our liking, we want to kind of try not to do what I'm doing. You don't want to yank on these wires too much as you're weaving, because you will malform it, and this will no longer look nice and fit properly into the space. So when you draw them across to each other, you want to keep that wire taut, because you do want it to have that nice back and forth, and you don't want a bunch of loose wire floating around in there. But you don't want to keep it too taut. You don't want to pull to the point where you're misplacing the wires or moving them around. And I like to, as I'm weaving, you'll see I usually take my finger and just kind of press that down into place as I'm going. And that keeps my weave nice and tight. And this is another one of those parts where it's not really fun and exciting doing this part. It's just kind of twisting back and forth. But when it's done, it does look quite stunning. And every now and then I get to the point where my wire is not loose enough off my spool, and I have to go loosen it for a second. And this is where the YouTube tutorials are way better than the live tutorial type things, because they can just skip through all this and you don't have to watch it. I'm sorry, because I'm sure this isn't the most interesting thing to watch. It's really not the most interesting thing to weave either. And every now and then, if you want to, if you are worried that you're misforming your wires and beating them up and knocking them all over the place, you can come back in here and just make sure that they're still sitting where you want them to sit, that this is still curving along this outside, that this is still going to cover the edge of this crystal and hold it down. And it looks like everything's good, so I go back to my weaving. Pam, are you dead? Or sleeping? Or are you eating something? I ate a bunch of sweet potato fries earlier. It's completely irrelevant to the wrapping, but it was very relevant to my life. I love sweet potato fries. Now, one thing that I do when I'm getting into these areas where I have a very tight curve right here and not so much on the top, I will adjust how many times I loop on one versus the other, because otherwise you're going to get out of sync in about how far you've gone. So on the top one, where there's more distance to travel, instead of doing 2, I'll switch to 4 or 5, just to kind of push it forward. And if you want a longer distance between these little weaves right here, it will also help with that, because how many times you wrap is going to be the spacing between those wires. So as you do this, if you're still only doing 2 on the inside one and you're doing 4 or 5 on the outside one, you'll notice that the inside everything stays closer together, but it's going to spread out at the top. I still don't know if you're watching because you're not saying, oh, you said you're enjoying it. Awesome. And also sometimes when working off the spool, if you're not careful, all the wire behind you, if you have too much of it, will get all tangled. So every now and then I check and make sure that I'm not tangling everything off of the spool into a huge, horrible mess. As you get to this part where it's spreading out too, it's important to kind of make sure you don't beat your wire up as you're wrapping it, because you want it to be nice and straight when you're pulling it across here. If it's all wrinkled and messed up, you're not going to get that nice smooth back and forth here. At this point, we're getting pretty far in, and you kind of want to pop in here and see if you've gotten far enough to where your wire is covering the parts that you want. And in this case it is. It's getting all the way up there. So I'll just go ahead and usually pop that down to the bottom one and wrap it around 1 or 2 times. Just kind of tie it off and then cut it off of the spool. And as with everything, once you've tied it off, I like to twist and clean off any little extra pieces. I had not yet, so I'm going to go down to the bottom and trim off any extra down here as well. So this gives you that loop part. And what we're going to want to do is I'm going to want to mount this guy on it. And I'm kind of going to give myself a curve here so that he's going to follow this loop. I want him to sit kind of towards the top of it. So check that right there and make sure that I'm happy with how that sits. And then we will start connecting everything. And I'll slide my crystal in. Once we do this next part, the crystal should stay in pretty well by itself, because this is gonna, if I put it in the right direction, it's gonna hold this all together. So this is gonna cut across it, and I'm gonna bend this around everything, and you want to aim right here where this back and forth ends as where your bend is. And then this guy, sometimes the tops are a little bit longer and they kind of cause a tiny bit of collapse up here, so you want to be careful, and if you're causing that, just kind of try and avoid it as much as possible. So I'm going to flip around here and look into connecting these guys to the frame. First part being that I want these two to go underneath the frame because it's going to make them way easier to connect. So I'm going to slide this down in there and then put my crystal back in. And you can see at this point where it's really starting to take shape. So we're going to go in here, trim these two. And like I did before, I'm just going to kind of create a loop with this and feed that loop around and through the frame section. And the same thing over here. We're going to bring this around, feed it back in on itself. And this guy right here, I'm not really liking how he's crossing over, so I'm going to actually tuck him down under here and trim him off at this point. And as we keep seeing more stuff that we do help the pendant take shape, you're going to kind of adjust certain things to keep them from overlapping each other in the wrong way. We want this piece to stay on the outside, so I'm going to kind of nudge it into place there. And then I'm going to take this guy here, and I'm going to kind of get an idea of exactly where I need to bend this guy down in order for these guys to sit where I want them. And once we know that, we can feed this underneath as well to the back of the frame. And one thing that I do like to do with these, because it can be hard to find a place to tie off 4 different wires, I'll split these half rounds that you can't see because I'm sorry, this keeps kind of slowly falling. Split the half rounds out and just wrap them in either direction. It's going to create a kind of a Y over here. And that lets me end these guys off over here where I don't have to worry so much, and it's not a bad looking ending. So you can see, I hope, my little Y that I have right there. And you can actually see right on here that same ending where once it's oxidized, it's a nice little Y with a loop past it. So I'm going to tuck this down through here and have these guys loop over. And in this case, I'm actually pulling it down far enough that you're not going to really see that closure that I just made. And it looks like my loop that I made up here is just a little bit too high. So I'm going to go in and tighten this down a little bit more to keep my sapphires from sliding completely underneath the pendant where you can't see them. Take this end off here. And as I'm tightening these sapphires on, I want to make sure that I'm not doing too horribly at popping this out from underneath or out from above the crystal that it's holding in. But I do plan on running 1 or 2 more wires around here to create a swirl. So we're just going to let these guys sit. A lot of times my opinion is if it's currently holding itself in place without you tying it down, don't tie it down, because then you can go back in and adjust it later if you need to. So these guys are all kind of just sitting here waiting to be tied, but not yet completely tied to the frame. And I'm going to take, because my favorite thing to make swirls with is square wire, because it just really, I think, works well sitting next to each other. Take a couple pieces of square wire. And in my true fashion of cutting way too much, I'm leaving myself a fair amount to work with here, because I don't know exactly how much I'm going to need for these swirls. So I've got my wires here, and I'm going to take a weaving wire and connect them together. And this is really nothing special. I'm just wrapping them together to hold them together, because when I create swirls with these guys, I actually like it that they sit right up against each other. And I would normally do this with half round, but I'm doing it with weaving wire for this mini because I'm afraid that if I do it with half round, it's going to make it too thick and it's not going to sit nicely against this small pendant. So you're the only one watching, but my weaving wire is 28 gauge if anybody watches this later and is curious. I'm going to point this downward and just feed it right on through here. Come on, buddy. And then bring this. And this part's really just kind of organic. Once you get it in there, you're just gonna create a curve and let the wire really kind of do what it wants to do. The one thing that I do is I kind of hold against it enough to kind of keep those wires right next to each other as I'm swirling them. And sometimes I'll put my finger flat against it and use that as a way to kind of hold that swirl together. Once I've brought it around, I'm going to bring these straight across the back. And that last little swirl right there is going to be the last piece that we need to really hold this crystal into place. So at this point, what we really have is a mess of all the pieces in the back that we want to use to connect this thing together. And I'm going to cut these weaving wires out of the way. So I am going to bring this piece straight across and towards the middle here, where I have that wire that runs straight down the middle. And I'm just going to get it out of the way so that I can take this end of those two square wires, and we're going to wrap them right along here and then around the frame to tie them off. And for these guys, I'm taking them around the back of the crystal just as a little bit of extra mounting piece behind it that'll help hold on. I could have taken them around the center piece as well. Either way would have worked. And then I'm going to use these pliers, which have the tiniest little needle noses, so they really get into places. Pinch that down to hold it together. So this piece that I've run underneath the frame, I'm literally just going to fold back over on itself, snip, and then pinch down. And by the time I'm done, I usually have to sweep because I just throw little pieces of wire everywhere. And that's one of the reasons why I don't like working in silver, because in silver, it's within your best interests to save all those little pieces that you're snipping off. We have these guys right here. These two square pieces are the connections for the bottom of our sapphires. And we're going to do the same thing where we're just going to snip these and run them around the frame. Go around front and use that to push these guys down and against themselves. So at this point, we're kind of starting to tie off all these different little ends. Got one more of these square guys that I forgot to tie off. And it just kind of starts not only smoothing everything down back here so that you have a cleaner space to work with, but kind of finishing that pendant now to where things are going to start holding together because they're tied off. So then we want to make sure that we haven't massively malformed anything while we've been smushing it around over there before we go to the back and start finishing off the other side. Now for these guys, I'm gonna kind of loop them around because they're being used almost as a bail. Like I have the bail that I created, but these guys are following the bail. So I'm going to loop it around and connect it over here in a way that allows that to stick out and still be part of the bail. And I'm going to get this piece of weaving wire from earlier where we attached to the frame. and never trimmed it off. And I'm going to go ahead and trim that off. There we go. And I'm going to go back through in a little while and actually check for any pointy ends and smooth them down, file them down, clean them off, anything like that. So I'm going to take this guy, actually try and feed him under the frame, and then back around on himself. Sometimes, no matter how good your pliers are, it's just easier to get in there and smush it with your fingers. I'm going to do a similar thing with all three of the wires that run inside of here. I'm going to take all of them, kind of bring them in a curve this way. I've actually accidentally smushed one down against the crystal over here. And I gotta kind of pluck it out. There we go. So we're going to take all three of these and do the same thing. Kind of bring them around that initial bail that we had created. And over here to the side where we can attach them. And the cleanest way to do that, you're going to want to keep this one after the other. Make sure that you don't like cross this wire over the top because it's not going to be as clean. I'm streaming to Pamela. Once in a blue moon, somebody else logs in for a second, but Pam was curious. So, this guy, I don't know, you can't see anything I'm doing anymore. Alright, here we go. This guy, I actually missed the frame when I spun it around, so I have to undo him and reattempt to kind of loop him around the frame right there. Once these three pieces are all in here, we'll pinch them shut through the back. And then, because I'm kind of filling in this bail area, I'm going to go in here with my rounded pliers and pinch to make sure that I open that bail area back up, because you still need a place to be able to send that piece of necklace or whatever, cord, whatever you want to put it on through. And we're going to take these guys right here and we're going to connect them to the center piece of the frame. And all the little connecty pieces are very much the same. Just trim them close. Twist them around and then close them off. And the final piece is this loop right here. You want to make sure that it's sitting in a good place. And then you're going to bring it around and also connect it to the frame. I feel like the whole time I'm doing this, I just need to be constantly apologizing for how badly I estimate how much wire I need. Because I'm constantly cutting off giant tails. I make a lot of jump rings. Or little tiny pieces that I need. Out of all of these pieces, I try not to waste them. Okay. So now, I just threw him. We have our little guy. And again, like I said, sometimes you just gotta go in with your fingers and kind of smush things into exactly where you want them. And I am adjusting the sapphires a little bit because they have twisted their way slightly out of the loop that I wanted them on. Now, when I get to this part, what I usually do is I just start looking at pieces like this and saying, where do I have something that looks like it needs to be filled in or adjusted? So looking at this, I see there's just like a little place right there, and it either needs these guys to be tied against it, or it needs another piece of wire to run through there. So I can do one of two things here. I can run a piece of wire up and around through here to kind of fill that space, or I can take weaving wire and I can kind of go through these three things and tie it together. And it really just depends on how happy you are with the look of the piece. If you really don't want this extra wire that's going to be running through here, or if you think that the extra wire is helpful. What I do sometimes, I can just show you really quick, is I will grab a piece of square wire. I'll bend it at the end and just start twisting it. And you see how you get this nice twisted texture to it. So if I know that I'm going to have to fill in an area, I'll get this twisted square wire and I'll actually use that as my fill-in, and that way, depending on where I decide to run it, you get this nice little extra bit of texture that runs through the piece. And in this case, I actually kind of like that, and I think I'm gonna tie that down there and leave it. So I'm gonna tie this around here really quick. And keep trying to do this where you can see it, so you're not just listening to me talk. Sorry, Pam. I'm not sure what wire. Oh, I see what wire that is. Okay. I'm just in here tightening up this piece of wire that was sticking out so that I can trim it down and stop it from sticking out. Dog, please leave the cat alone. Please? The cat doesn't like you. You're not friends. It's not you, it's her. She doesn't like any dogs. Alright. And this is gonna be tied down right here on the frame. I'm gonna tighten this piece down one more time because it's just, there we go. Bring that up and around. And this is what we have ended up with. You can see the back where we've connected everything together. And I will go through and look at all of these little pieces where it is connected and have my flush cutters. When you're cutting with your flush cutters, just cutting your base wires and stuff, always use the back because you want the tip to be super sharp so that you can get in here and really just nip as close as possible when you're cleaning things out. And the sharper your flush cutters stay, the longer you can do that, the better it is. And I will go in here. I'm not sure if you can see this. In here, there's a wire that is kind of sitting sideways, and I will go in and kind of pinch that out and smooth it around. Just kind of cleaning up all the ends and everything, because I try to, as much as possible, keep the backs clean. And it's hard to have the world's cleanest backs when you're literally connecting everything from the front somewhere on the back. But if you keep your wires together, you try not to wrap too much too tight around, you can kind of keep everything as clean as possible and as close together as nice, like how these pieces are 3 wires that run together. It looks a lot cleaner than if you just move all 3 wires all over the place on the back and just look for a place to connect them. So the better you can do it connecting things that go together close to each other, the better it will look in the end. And near you, fighting with a piece of wire. I lost my favorite pair of pliers recently, and I got this new pair of pliers, and I don't know if you can see, but it's janky and cheap, and the more I use it, these right here, the tips, actually splay out to the point where they don't grab wire anymore, and it's very frustrating when it happens, because it basically leaves you unable to get hold of these tiny wires and really finish them off. And that's such an important part of cleaning up the back, especially since, as you've seen as I've been showing it, the back is just a little messy on this guy right now. Dog, if you knock over my laptop, we're gonna fight. Please lay down. Or go in the other room. This isn't a good room to be playing with. And you just want to be careful. This is like object lesson of something that I've done. Right here you can see where that piece that I just added, I actually just pulled it way too tight, and when I did, it kind of pulled it underneath everything else. So it's not laying nicely, it's not as visible, it's not actually covering what I wanted it to cover. And it's tied in there, so now I have to wiggle it out. And I might not even be able to wiggle it out. It's really cranked in there. And sometimes when I do this, I just have to give up and snip it as close to the exit as possible, as close to where it's connected, and just leave a tiny piece behind. But I think I actually, there we go. I actually did find the end of this one, and I can disconnect it and try to save it. There we go. And I can't. I actually have broken it off. So I'm going to take this guy, and I actually still like the look. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this guy off, and I'm going to replace him with another wire and do my best to actually not over crank him and pull him underneath everything. And that is definitely something that you want to watch out for when you're cleaning everything up on the back, is just don't yank it so hard that you rearrange everything on the front. And watch me smile and nod and pretend that I did that on purpose. I definitely didn't. Depending on how much texture I want when I'm doing this, sometimes I actually crank the square wire with a drill. Let me move all these little pieces out of the way so you can actually see what I'm doing, kind of. So I'm gonna slide this under here again, same as I had before, and connect this to this frame. Where's my pliers? Working with the world's tiniest pliers, because why not? Please come here. And dog, please don't do that. Sif. Sif. I know what you're doing under there. You're only under there because the cat's under there. I'm aware. Alright, so we're going to run this guy through here again. Fill this section back in. Only this time we're going to bring it around and be careful not to over tighten it. Hey doggo, hey buddy. While I'm back here, I'm just tightening down a couple of other things. One of the important parts of not over tightening is leaving yourself a long enough tail to actually tighten this down. I think I trimmed it too short last time, so in attempting to smooth out this point that I had created, I had to crank it really far down to get it to smooth out against itself. Alrighty then. So this one is sitting in there better and not taking up. And the final piece of the puzzle is actually going in and just taking a little bit of weaving wire, and like I discussed earlier, you kind of want to run it along these places where it's going to be hidden within the existing weaves. And we're going to take some weaving wire and just use that to connect the different pieces of this pendant together and make sure that they stay that way. Because when you're layering stuff together, a lot of times you're just laying that stuff against each other, and while this pendant is nice and pretty sturdy at this point, there is just that little bit of give and wiggle that you want to go ahead and keep from happening, because metal fatigue, the more your wires wiggle around and jiggle around, there's the possibility of one of them breaking or a stone wiggling out of place, and I'm not okay with the risk of my stones going somewhere they're not supposed to go. So I'm just gonna go right through here and through the back, and then I'm just gonna kind of do an over under here. I go over that guy. Go around this guy. Come up here. If I can come up here, please. I'm gonna kind of, as I'm drawing this one in, I'm gonna adjust it to make sure that I pull it even with these guys. And I want to kind of, like I said, slide it into this weave. And it should, at that point, kind of almost disappear. So that it's not obvious that I've run weaving wire through here, because it's not bad that you're running the weaving wire through here, but it's, if you have an aesthetic that you're looking for on the pendant that doesn't involve a bunch of little tiny wires just tying it together, the more that you can hide that, the better. And we're gonna slip this one down in between two of those pieces a half round as we tighten it. And then I'm going to tie these two to the back. And what you'll notice now is that I no longer have that ability to just kind of lift these pieces off the pendant. They're held down and comfortably a part of the pendant at this point. And as you're tying this off, if you have a section back here that's kind of ugly, like my sense with these 4 wires that come across here, you can kind of wrap around them, not only to tie it off, but to hide some of that overlap and give yourself a much cleaner looking piece in the back here. And there we go. At this point, I will oxidize it. And I generally try not to do that in my kitchen because it can be stinky. And even though I can't smell it because I have anosmia, I'm sure my husband doesn't appreciate me making rotten egg smell in the middle of my kitchen. Just kind of mushing that right into place there. And any little adjustments that I feel need to be done, like going in and kind of spreading these out a little bit off of my sapphires or anything, I'll go ahead and do those. As last minute, I joke that the largest part of my wire wrapping is just me nudging things around, but it's kind of true. Once you've got everything mostly in place, you're going to want to kind of just go in and smooth it that last little bit out to make sure it's exactly where you want it. And it's laying against the other stuff exactly how you want it. And I always go through, just kind of run through and check multiple times around the back, make sure that everything that I've done is nice and smooth. And I'm not really pointing at most of it, but there's a huge mess on my table, and I don't know where my file is. And I knew where it was yesterday, but I'm not sure where it is. But when I find it, I will go through and just hit those little points with the file. Just run along them and make sure that any burrs, any places where I've dug into the copper with my pliers and created pointy areas that will catch, I will go in and I will file those flat and clean them off. And yeah, I'm not even gonna try. I promise you, there's a huge mess over there. So I'm gonna pop on Messenger, but as you can see, it's a pretty consistent little method there, and I will post pictures once I do oxidize it, but I'm not gonna try and figure out how to pick up this tripod and carry it outside and everything. And I have to set a kettle of hot water, so this will probably wait, and then I will post pictures when it is done. All right, Pam, now you know you need it because it's pink.